"Leave this row at once. You are not on the list, old man." The police officer leaned in so close that the gleam of his badge blinded. His tone was not a request, but a command. The old man slowly lifted his gaze, not out of fear, but from the habit of silently enduring storms. On his knees lay a crumpled envelope, and his fingers clutched a military dog tag. On his chest was a small medal, barely noticeable, yet more weighty than any decoration. He had promised a dying wife to be present when their son stepped onto the stage, and he was there. "You are in the wrong seat," the police repeated. The old man said nothing. He adjusted the lapel of his jacket, where no more ribbons could fit. Behind the curtains, the names of graduates resonated, while he counted the beats of his heart. Less than 10 minutes remained until his son's turn. He would not leave, because a soldier's word is an order, even when given to oneself. The old man reached out and touched the edge of the seat in front of him, as if testing the ground's steadiness. This simple gesture held a vow. He would not go anywhere. His wife, lying in the hospital, had once whispered, "Can you keep the promise?" He answered, "Yes." And now it was time to fulfill it. Suddenly, a soft creak echoed from his left. A little girl ran along the row, carrying a bouquet. He gently moved aside to avoid blocking her, and felt his chest tighten with pure joy. The world continued to live. It was for this very reason that he had once raised himself and other soldiers from the ground, under Grant, refusing to let them rest forever. The police stepped through the narrow aisle between. He lined up precisely close enough that his boot's heel lightly touched the worn toe of the old man's shoe. The harsh shine of polished leather carried the weight of an unspoken sentence. "I will say this only once," he stated calmly, without raising his tone, as if accustomed to giving orders, without concern for who might be hurt. "You have no right to be here. Stand up and proceed to the exit." The words fell heavily, like weighty stones. The old man slowly lifted his gaze and met the eyes of the uniformed man, but remained silent. He only straightened his back. The spotlight snagged pale folds of his gray hair, one stray lock escaping beneath his cap. Yet his shoulders stayed firm, as though held by unseen straps of a load-bearing vest, long since removed. The police officer turned to his assistant and said sharply, "Check the documents." A young sergeant, barely more than a youth, stepped forward holding out his hand, displaying an emblem badge. "Your invitation, citizen. Please, no unnecessary questions." The old man extended the invitation card, carefully pushing aside a small envelope and a token so as not to crumple the paper. The cardboard slightly trembled, mirroring the faint shake in his joints. The sergeant scanned the text, and then the old man's face, then without blinking handed the ticket back to his partner. "The seat number does not match," he announced absurdly, although the numbers were exactly right. "Move him to the back of the hall." A whisper spread like a wave. One parent rose on tiptoes, trying to spot the source of the turmoil. A woman in a red dress murmured to her neighbor, "He is someone, after all, among the relatives. Why treat him like that?" But the neighbor merely shrugged, hesitant to get involved. The old man stood still. To his right sat the elderly wife of a veteran from another unit, clutching a bouquet of carnations tightly in her hands. She averted her eyes, showing guilt. Her upbringing would not allow her to intervene. The police officer, feeling the weight of his own authority, leaned in closer. "I do not want to use force. Let us step outside calmly." The only response was silence. Silence spread its wings and settled over the hundreds of muted voices, hushed by the strange scene. From deep within the hall came a hoarse shout from a teenager. "He belongs here." The boy's mother silenced him by placing her palm on his shoulder. The stranger's fear amplified the power of the uniform. The sergeant grasped the old man's elbow. The young police officer's fingers were warm, as if he himself feared his actions, and sweated with tension. Slowly, the old man turned his head, his eyes frozen in the dim glow of the lamps. Calm, almost expressionless, yet in their depths lay the cold of distant mountains, where stubbornness meant survival. "Remove your hand," he said softly, without threat or plea. That brief phrase held no volume in voice, but carried the strength of memory. The teenagers he once commanded had tried to grasp his elbow when a shell fell. The sergeant pulled back his hand, as if burned. The chief police officer raised an eyebrow, but before he could lean forward again, a woman in the neighboring row stood up. "Gentlemen, this man came to support his son," she said. She stood upright, just like in her youth when she used to teach elementary school. Her voice trembled slightly, yet a sense of dignity echoed within it. The police officer waved his hand and said, "Please have a seat. Do not disturb." The woman lowered herself again, hiding her face behind her hand. A foreign shame tightened her shoulders, although she carried no guilt. Meanwhile, the ceremony on stage went on. The announcer called out the next graduate. The school orchestra played a brief fanfare, but the music was now barely audible. A muted murmur grew louder in the hall. Every whisper, every breath seemed unusually loud, because people feared speaking aloud. The chief police officer stepped back slightly, as if giving the old man a final chance to reconsider his decision. Then, seeing that persuasion was useless, he gestured to the sergeant and said, "We are taking him out." Two men stepped forward. One reached for the back of the chair, while the other prepared the plastic restraint kept in his chest pocket for unruly spectators. Using it on a gray-haired man felt absurd, but orders had to be followed without question. The old man placed an envelope on his lap, pressing down on the metal with his finger to keep it steady, and stood up. His height was almost the same as the chief police officer's, but his frail figure made him seem fragile. He stood silently, like a granite statue before a memorial plaque. At that moment, a camera shutter clicked in the gallery. Someone's son tried to capture the scene on their parents' old camera. The sound was louder than a gunshot. The audience fell silent. Finally, the old man extended his hand, inviting the police officers to proceed. "Do you have the documents?" he asked calmly. "Feel free to check," he added. His voice was deep and somewhat muffled, resembling the tone of military communication devices. He did not resist, merely stated the facts. The sergeant unfolded the passes and examined the signature of the school principal. The signature was genuine. He glanced up at the commander, who was unwilling to lose face. "Do not delay the ceremony," the commander muttered, and pushed the old man gently toward the entrance. The curtain on the stage moved as the next segment of performances was about to begin. The host used the pause to offer words of gratitude. However, no one was really listening. The audience's focus was fixed on the entrance, where the old man took a short step forward and stopped again. His face showed neither protest nor plea, only exhaustion. It seemed as if he allowed fate to mark one more line on his worn-out map, yet the final destination remained unchanged. A police officer reached for the radio on his shoulder, preparing to call for backup to quietly remove the unwanted visitor. From the walls came a cold echo in reply. A thin whine from the speaker was interrupted by static. It seemed to him that any extra noise could trigger the crowd. Then he added in a hurried whisper, "Do not make this complicated, Father. Let's keep it simple. No unnecessary pride." The old man glanced at his watch, where the long hand slowly crossed the number 7. There was very little time left before his son's appearance. 7 minutes, he whispered, barely moving his lips. The sergeant, catching the whisper, tensed up, but he did not grasp the meaning of the words. The old man understood everything. He would endure this sentence. And if in those distant days he had held the line for 16 hours without water, then now he certainly would not back down before 2 aggressive young men in uniform. Meanwhile, anxiety spread throughout the hall. Someone tried to approach the foyer to call the director, but the corridor was guarded by the same police officers who had entered this room instead of the usual security service. Whether this was an order from the department or a personal initiative, no one knew. However, power revealed its harsh face, and this face was unwilling to hear any proof. The old man took a deep breath, felt a sharp prickling in his chest, and realized that his heart reminded him of an old wound. He clenched his fist, hiding the pain within. This was not a physical ache, but shame. Shame for a country where gray hair offered no protection from humiliation, for children who witnessed strangers pushing their fathers. Still, even this shame was less than his duty. His wife had asked, and his promise was worth more than any offense. The police officer gripped his elbow more firmly. "Let us go. I am not going anywhere," the old man said firmly. Though his voice was quiet, it carried a certain chill like cold steel. "Will you come?" the police officer responded, signaling to a colleague. The sergeant stepped behind the old man, ready to twist his arms. The room held its breath. It seemed that the fragile thread of submission was about to snap, and something irreversible would happen before the eyes of children receiving their graduation certificates. Only one person remained motionless: the old man, whose life had grown among mountains, dust, and bursts of gunfire. He knew how to wait, he knew how to endure, he knew how to conquer. All with silence. The creak of chairs echoed from the left. One of the teachers straightened up, seemingly ready to intervene, but the head of studies' gaze made him freeze. The story continues. Where are you joining us from? Subscribe to the channel. Teenagers in the gallery stopped whispering, dropping the ceremony programs onto their laps. The stage, where in a few minutes the triumphant march was to be played, seemed distant like a forgotten opera house poster. Everyone present suddenly recalled their grandfathers returning from Afghanistan with heavy backpacks and a silent stare that could not be challenged. Yet no one moved while the power's uniform drilled the hall with empty eyes on targets. The police officer wanted to take the final step, but swayed, as if sensing behind his back a stream of quiet discontent directed at him. The old man stood still, but behind him the first witnesses began to lift their heads. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a gray suit, a middle-aged woman with a serious face, a young man whose hand rested on a crutch. They did not shout or wave their arms, only watched intently, demanding an explanation, full of bewilderment. There was no aggression in their gazes. Instead, heavy as granite, silent condemnation was growing. None of them uttered a single word, yet their silence spoke louder than the fiercest speeches. The second hand made another tiny jump. 6 minutes remained before the long-awaited moment. From the stage came ringing and girlish laughter. Another graduate elegantly and with finesse bowed to the audience and passed a bouquet to her classmate, with whom she had shared 4 years of lessons. Life went on as if nothing had happened, yet the heartbeat of the whole pulsed in a tense rhythm of anticipation. The police officer lifted his radio once more, but his hand trembled. He clearly realized that if he pressed the call button, chaos might erupt on the small island of that ill-fated corridor. And then, the blame for spoiling the celebration would fall squarely on the uniforms. Memories of instructions, protocols, and orders from superiors flashed through his mind. But not a single guideline offered a clear solution for what to do if the crowd considered the police actions unfair. He lowered his hand, pretending to adjust his belt, mentally weighing the pros and cons. The old man stood like a statue sculpted from living flesh. This stillness unsettled the uniform more than any form of resistance. Within the tense circle of time, a fragile pause arose. The spectators sensed that a small movement would tip the situation out of control, but the old man remained motionless. He silently repeated, 5 minutes, and every soul in the crowded hall heard this quietness clearly. The sergeant glanced at the school clock above the entrance. The hand seemed to move with deliberate slowness, as if the whole world had taken the old man's example and refused to hurry. Someone timidly closed the program folder, and the quiet sound of cardboard snapping echoed like a loud gunshot in the general silence. The police officer. He exhaled deeply, knitting his thick eyebrows in a gesture of irritated patience, and suddenly realized his knees were trembling. The unexpected echo of a foreign cane striking the marble floor cut through the silence. The police officer flinched. The old man raised his gaze, and the hall seemed to stretch like a delicate spring, ready to snap upright. From the far corridor, the first person entered the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his hair thickly flecked with gray. An ancient patch darkened his nose bridge, a remnant from a once broken eyeglass lens. In his hand, he held the very cane that a friend had once carved from a broken rifle stock. The cane tapped again, and that sound rolled through the rows like the rumble of an approaching storm. Following him was another man. No fancy jackets or stylish ties adorned them. Their simple, yet well-pressed shirts and smooth infantry wool tunics were paired with boots, polished to a mirror shine. Each wore a small ribbon on their lapels, signifying a lifetime of honors, orders of the Red Star, medals for bravery, badges for service to the motherland. None of these men hurried. They walked in step, as if traversing a mountain path once more, where every tread was essential to avoid falling into an abyss. The sergeant turned around, his eyes widening because such men were only seen in parades and old footage. The police chief tensed. Nobody had warned about such important visitors. Yet the veterans seemed oblivious to the police, focusing solely on the old man who stood motionless, like a milestone on the road to the final battle. The cane struck the floor a third time. From the second row, a man with a closely cropped haircut and a healed scar on his forehead stood up. Without a word, he bowed to the elderly gentleman, then turned to face the police officers, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had entered first. Next, a woman rose, small and delicate, yet her eyes mirrored the same depth of experience. Behind her, the sleeve of a medical service uniform jacket hung slightly loose, neatly hemmed and tucked under time's wear. The room no longer whispered, but filled with heavy sighs, as if everyone feared breaking the silence with their own breath. Someone, with a lump pressing on their throat, recalled the television footage showing paratroopers landing amid towering mountain ranges. Now these individuals stood once again among their ranks, unarmed, but carrying that unyielding faith which sustained them in foreign lands. The police chief lifted his hand, as if to command everyone to their places, yet it paused mid-air. He noticed the gaze of the tallest veteran locked firmly onto his face. Calm, stern, and clearly unspoken. The look seemed to question, "Who are you to give us orders?" Each wrinkle on the veteran's face resembled a trench carved by shrapnel. In that moment, the chief grasped that a single misstep would forever shatter the audience's respect for the uniform. The veterans quietly dispersed to the sides of the aisle, forming what felt like an honor corridor. The man leaning on a cane stepped closer to the elderly gentleman. Without a word, he raised his hand and gently touched 2 fingers to the medal for bravery on the old man's chest. He did this with such care, it seemed he feared disturbing an open wound. Their eyes met briefly, and the elderly man barely. He breathed in deeply, as if he had finally returned home after a long journey. The police retreated to the wall, giving way to the elderly men who took their places in line. The chief tried to appear in control of the situation, but it was too late. The balance of power had shifted, and now the authority belonged to the gray-haired veterans who understood the value of silent order. In the voices of the onlookers, a quiet approval began to stir. Soft but persistent, it resembled the first drops of rain trembling on the scorching ground. One of the veterans stepped forward just a half step. His voice was low, but shattered the silence like steel breaking thin glass. He survived in the battle because he pulled us out from under the mortar fire. These words were not a threat. They were a testament. The chief of police opened his mouth, but dryness gripped his throat. Drowning in the unexpected quiet, he realized he did not have the right words. Orders, medals, gunshots, all these remained in history textbooks. Yet the people from those pages still stood in the hallway, breathing the same air as him. The sergeant lowered his eyes, still holding the plastic tie in his hand, and suddenly blushed like a boy caught doing something wrong. He hid the tie in his pocket and stepped back behind the chief's back. The old man said nothing. He was part of the landscape of this silent battle, where weapons were glances and memories. The crowd, holding back relieved sighs, felt the shift, as if the air had become cleaner and the weight lifted. Slowly, the old man took a step toward his own place. He returned to his seat, carefully placing the envelope on his lap. No applause erupted in the hall. Respect was shown not by thunderous clapping, but by a silence that resembled a prayer. The room filled with the heavy breaths of men and women who had walked the same path as he had. There were 12 of them, 12 individuals who brought not the flash of fireworks to the graduation ceremony, but the solemnity of lived years. Police officers stood against the wall like students before the blackboard when a teacher suddenly presents an obscure problem. On stage, the host finally noticed that the audience's focus wasn't on her. She fell silent, losing her words, while the cold lamps continued pouring white light, unmoved by human dramas. After a moment, a soft sob was heard in the hall. It was the graduate's mother, who recognized the elderly man as the brave neighbor once carrying a heavy bucket of water to neighborhood children during a summer drought. Veterans took seats a few rows behind. The walking stick found support beside the wooden armrest, tapping its tip on the floor as if marking the rhythm of an old march. None of these people intended to raise banners or shout slogans. They brought not a cry, but the weight of a word: duty, which rarely is spoken aloud, yet threatens to collapse if betrayed. The police chief drew a deep breath, and with a heavy smile, as though pushing a stone away from his chest, nodded to the oldest guest among them. The nod was an acknowledgement. Today the order is not delivered by him. The sergeant felt the sharp steel of shame burn through the collar of his uniform. He pressed his hand to, tipping his cap in a gesture of courteous greeting. He lowered his gaze. The elderly man closed his eyes for a moment, letting his heart find a new rhythm. Now it beat not against the crowd, but synchronized with it. An unseen thread of brotherhood settled once more upon his shoulders, warming them better than any greatcoat could. He realized that in exactly 1 minute, the next graduate would be announced, and it would be his son. The silence that followed their exchanged glances still held the hall captive, yet gradually a calming current of hope spread through the rows of seats. Some quietly wiped away tears. Others straightened their posture. The aged school principal, dry and gaunt like a veteran geography teacher, carefully stepped out from the service door at the side of the stage. Anxiety was visible on his face, but his eyes reflected deep respect. In the past, he had served on the border himself and understood the difference between a lawbreaker and a person who had defended the nation. The principal approached the police chief and whispered something. The chief nodded silently. The decision was made without argument. The rule book, where the word safety often became a club, had proved weaker than a soft-spoken testimony of bravery. The principal turned back to the audience, raised his hand, and requested silence. Even though no loud voices disturbed the hall, he spoke just a few words. The ceremony continues. Thank you for your understanding. Then he slowly retreated behind the curtains, stroking his trembling beard. The hall exhaled, but before the orchestra struck the next note, a quiet rustling was heard. Those seated by the walls rose and offered their seats to the veterans. No one was forced. No one insisted. He persuaded them. The audience counted for themselves. It seemed right that these people should be closer to the stage. The veterans nodded modestly as they accepted the offers. The old man stayed in his spot, not pushing ahead of the others. He already had what he wanted, the chance to watch his son receive his diploma. The police stepped back toward the door, monitoring the perimeter without the former arrogance. The sergeant hid his hands behind his back, clenching his fingers, as if promising himself not to forget what he had learned in the last few minutes. The chief pursed his lips and locked eyes with one of the veterans, who gave a slight, almost invisible nod. That nod sealed an unspoken agreement. No one was humiliated, but order was restored. The old man took a deep breath, sensing the scent of inspired, slightly dusty joy that comes from large gatherings. Once, in Afghanistan, the air had burned with gunpowder and hot sand. There he dreamed of such a peaceful moment when the clatter of a cane would be the loudest sound. The dream came true at home. Bittersweet, perhaps, but it fulfilled a hope. The hall gradually came to life. Somewhere to the right, a girl whispered to her mother that she was afraid of being late for the photo, and her mother comforted her with a gentle touch on the shoulder. In front, a man with glasses adjusted his tie, as if newly realizing the evening belonged to the children and not fear. The old man placed his hand over an envelope. His wife's letter trembled along with his heart. "You will be there when they call him," she wrote shortly before the illness ended her breath, and he was there. Only a thin thread of seconds remained. Lights gleamed on the stage, flickering with each shift in brightness. Another group of graduates lined up behind the crimson wheel. The orchestra softly tuned the brass instruments. The old man caught his son's gaze, peeking from behind the velvet curtain. The young man spotted his father, along with a row of gray-haired faces, and paused momentarily, as if silently comprehending everything. The old man gave a barely noticeable nod. That was enough to make the youth straighten his shoulders. The police chief stepped aside from the passageway, clearing the way for people instead of blocking it. The sergeant followed his lead. The veterans remained calm, yet their presence was as palpable as the scent of rain before a storm. Not a single sound disturbed the silence, yet everyone knew the room brimmed with invisible strength. The old man glanced briefly at his watch. The hand slowly passed the mark of 7 minutes. The time had expired. He had not lost. He had done the very same thing he had done many years ago on every front line. He had stood firm. To the left of the stage, the musicians raised their wind instruments, and the first chord of the school anthem gently flowed into the hall. A steady bass drum beat sounded, signaling the next part of the program. It was at that moment the old man noticed one of the police officers, the very young sergeant, remove his cap and hold it to his chest. A gesture not found in any regulation, yet one sometimes required by conscience. Not for show, nor out of fear, but as a quiet acknowledgement of another's bravery. The old man replied with the slightest nod, thus concluding the chapter begun by the sharp voice of the uniform. The warm lamp light of the auditorium dissolved, giving way to what was coming next. A memory burst in uninvited, like the sudden flash of a flare in the night mountain pass. The old man kept his eyes open, yet saw a different scene. The edge of a narrow road hung above a ravine, damaged by a 3-ton truck, filled with the smell of burning fuel. It was evening. A tiny sun clung to the mountain peaks, painting the sky in a dirty pink shade. The convoy took a brief rest. They needed to reach the stronghold before darkness fell. Sergeant Nikolai Seryogin, a lean man of about 40 years, was in charge of rear security at that moment. He was checking the fastening of ration boxes when suddenly a sharp clap sounded. It was not a gunshot, but a sound like a palm hitting rubber. Then came the whistle of shrapnel. The first mine exploded near the kitchen. The sergeant sprang up and shouted to the drivers, "Turn off the engines!" And almost immediately, a second mine detonated further up the slope. Stones rained down, obscuring the sky. 3 soldiers, shielding their heads with helmets, scrambled for cover. The young machine gunner, Peter Krasnov, recently married, slipped, fell on one knee, and dropped his ammunition box. The sergeant ran up, lifted him, and pushed him behind the protection of an armored side. The blast raised a cloud of dust, turning everything into a gray blur, like an aged newspaper. Silence remained in the earpiece. Radio communication was cut off. The convoy commander, Captain Klimoff, yelled commands through a megaphone, but his words were swallowed by echoes. The sergeant moved higher up the slope, seeking a better view. The mountains hummed like an old transformer, his ears filled with a ringing noise. The heart of an unfamiliar beast was pounding in his chest. The third mine exploded on the road where the medical UAZ was stationed. Flames burst forth. The sergeant dashed downward. Inside remained 2 people, the driver and the medic. The door, twisted by a fragment, would not budge. The sergeant braced his feet against the crumbled stone and, biting off his glove, grabbed the scorching handle. His palm burned instantly, yet the door gave way. He pulled out the driver and then Ludmila Sharova, the petite medic, whose hearing doctors miraculously saved later. Sharova tried to say the first aid kit was still inside, but burning gasoline was already spreading at the bottom of the vehicle. The sergeant pressed his hand firmly over her mouth. Sometimes rescue means stopping a person from reckless courage. He led the wounded behind a rock, where a steep cliff formed a natural niche. There sat Pyotr Krasnov, tightly clutching a box with tape, as if it represented his spouse's way of life. Nikolai gave him a brief command. "Is the tape intact?" "Intact. Then you will live." Fire lit the slope with an orange glow. Small fragments rattled among the stones, yet the sergeant kept running between vehicles, pulling out documents and sleeping bags of those still breathing. Captain Klimoff finally reached him and shouted, "The road is blocked! We will break through! No delays!" But there was no time to reply. The 4th mine exploded in the air, sending shrapnel over the roofs of the truck cabins. The sergeant heard a sharp whistle. A shell grazed the rock above his head, dislodging debris that burned his neck. He fell to one knee, reaching for the radio. The noise persisted. Everything was drowned out in his ears, except the brief signals from the artillery operator. The enemy was close. The sergeant had only 2 seconds to decide whether to go down to the river or push through the road. Instead, he chose a third option, securing the high ground to evacuate the wounded later. He picked 5 of the most composed soldiers and showed them a route through the rough terrain known only from maps. Then he lifted the Red Cross flag. "Will you pull, brother?" The boy nodded despite the burning blister on his palm. From that moment on, they moved without speaking. The mountain air was dry, as if made from dust turned into glass. When the sun finally slipped beyond the ridge, the sky deepened into a velvet sack dotted with sparse stars. The gunfire subsided, but time was pressing. The wounded were losing blood fast. The sergeant assigned Peter to guard, handed him a radio with a spare battery, and went back down alone. He did not think of himself. His orders were to get the people out, and orders were never questioned. Crawling to the wrecked medical UAZ, he found the fire barely breathing due to lack of oxygen. The rocky slope radiated heat like a furnace. Inside the molten metal, he found a bag with bandages, slung it over his shoulder, and dragged one of the stretcher frames. His hand burned terribly. Blisters had already formed, and the skin had blackened. Thoughts of his wife lasted only a moment. Pain firmly held his mind on a short leash. About 10 minutes later, he returned to the shelter. Bullets no longer whistled. They had fallen silent, which was worse than gunfire. It meant the enemy was waiting, ready to strike again soon. The sergeant arranged the soldiers in a circle. Each person carried 2 magazines, just one per grenade. Grant lifted his head. Shadows flickered in the red afterglow of the fire as if demons were nodding from the sky. At that moment, Flares from their battalion exploded over the ridge. White stars burned through the darkness, and time slowly revealed itself. Shadows vanished. People saw each other, and fear retreated. Shielding his eyes from the blinding light, the sergeant heard the call signs of his own company. He gripped the radio tightly, shouted a response, and gave the first coordinates. Rescuing them felt surreal, like a dream, but this dream was paid for with the blood of those they could not carry out. By dawn, when the helicopter lifted the wounded on board, the heat had sunk into the earth. The sergeant crouched beside the stretcher marked with a red cross. A young soldier held his burned hand gently. Meeting the boy's eyes, the sergeant saw a silent vow. "I will survive. I will repay this debt." This promise pierced deeper than any fragment. Later came the hospital, surgeries, commissioner papers, medals. But the memory never let his hand completely forget the fire. The pain held in the world of the living, those who remained in the pale mountain ridges. The old man, that same sergeant, returned to the graduation hall when the musical number fell silent. His injured hand trembled beneath the envelope, but held the past as firmly as it once held the stretcher. He felt again the scent of burning gasoline amid the smell of perfume and the school cafeteria. No one noticed the shift in scenes except him. His gaze turned to his comrades. They too were remembering, and if the hall could read minds, people would witness it. If only they could see that treacherous mountain path where death lurked closer than the moving air. A cane, standing silently by the entrance, softly tapped the floor. The veteran, carrying a bag filled with memories, gave a subtle signal. The old man gently nodded. Memories returned home, and the room, once again, filled with the glow of electric lamps. Yet the heart resisted letting the image go so quickly. The old man recalled another scene, as if a smoldering ember suddenly flared with new strength. He walked down the hospital corridor, leaning on his bandaged elbow. The white walls, scented with medicine, echoed footsteps in such a hollow way that each sick echo seemed alive. Along the wall stood a metal stretcher. On it lay Junior Sergeant Ilya Levin, the young man the old man shielded during a mortar attack. Just a few millimeters, and one breath of happiness had escaped the boy. A shrapnel grazed tangentially, but struck an artery. The surgeon did everything possible. However, Levin passed away an hour after the operation. The old man remembered the silence in the ward. No screams, no groans, as if death itself kept silent. On the bedside table lay a photographic negative showing a young woman and a tiny child. The old man hid the photo in the pocket of his hospital gown, promising to deliver it to the family. Then he sat by the window, watching the wind stir the branches of acacia trees in the park, and wiped sweat from his forehead with his palm. Deep inside, a wave of bitterness rose. He allowed himself to cry only during the night. When the chamber was enveloped in darkness, tears fell slowly, as if measuring the minutes until relief. Half a year later, he journeyed to the Grant Military Academy in Moscow to receive national honors. A new medal gleamed on his chest, yet it felt like a heavy burden, a constant reminder of those left beneath foreign skies. That day, he vowed never to allow any foreign uniform to degrade the dignity of a person who had witnessed the horrors of war. Now, fate was testing that promise once more. The scene before his eyes regained the vividness of reality. The scarlet velvet curtains, the polished wooden floor, carefully arranged bouquets. The elder sensed the veteran sitting beside him. Peter Krasnov gently touched his shoulder. The young man who had once been a slender machine gunner had grown into a robust man, but the scar on his chin remained unchanged. Krasnov spoke no words, only a gaze filled with gratitude for the night of salvation. The elder returned a slight nod, gratitude acknowledged. The music director withdrew his hand, tapped the baton against the pupitre, and the orchestra began a soft introductory march. This was the signal to proceed with the ceremony. But before leaving the peaks of those distant mountains, another brief tale should be heard, without which today's silence among the veterans would feel incomplete. 3 days following the attack described above, a dust storm engulfed the convoy. The small town of Cherikar was shrouded in dust so dense that people lost sight of one another within 2 steps. Sergeant Seryogin commanded a temporary post at the crossroads. When a local boy with a bandaged leg crawled toward the anti-tank ditch, I noticed him immediately. He was shouting something in Farsi, waving his arms frantically. The sergeant brought him over to the communications squad, where the interpreter found out that 2 wounded civilians were still stuck at the far end of the village and could not be reached due to the storm. Without waiting for formal approval, the sergeant quickly assembled 3 volunteers, cut through the dust, treated the injured, and brought them safely back to our medical post. One of the rescued was an elderly man who used to trade dried fruits in a nearby settlement. In gratitude, he gave his rescuer a small copper teapot adorned with delicate engravings. The old man kept the teapot at home next to a photo of his wife, as a reminder that kindness cannot be measured by medals. The teapot had once been taken without permission by his son, who was very young at the time, to feed a kitten warm milk. The boy was then taught that some things must not be used for play because they carry the blood of grateful people. He remembered this lesson and never broke the silent laws of memory again. These thoughts flickered in the old man's mind like the glow of a lit cigarette before fading into the present moment. He heard the school anthem once more, saw the orchestra, and noticed the police chief shifting his weight against the wall as he contemplated everything he had just experienced. Yet the piercing gaze of the veterans kept mockery at a safe distance. There was no room for pretended remorse. The old man raised his hand and adjusted. The lapel of the jacket finally softened, and his shoulders eased. The stage was bathed in a golden glow from the spotlights, and for a moment, he thought the lamps above resembled fiery stars from a different sky. He knew less than half an hour remained until the end of the ceremony, but by now, no one dared to question the elderly man's right to sit where he had chosen. The last echo of the orchestra's trumpet faded beneath the wooden ceiling. The director returned to the stage, announced the final segment of the ceremony, and bowed gratefully to the parents. Yet most adults' eyes were not on the stage, but on the narrow aisle where the gray-haired veterans carried what had once been impassive silence. The eldest among the veterans, the first to enter with a cane, rose from his seat. Turning to the police chief, he spoke quietly, articulating each word like sealing a certificate. "Sir Officer, we thank you for your service. Please take a comfortable position to avoid distracting the children." These words were neither a command nor sarcasm. They formed a bridge of respect laid over the recent rift of hostility. The chief responded with a brief nod and stepped back toward the doors. The sergeant remained nearby, but his expression had shifted. His eyes revealed shame, relief, and perhaps a quiet admiration one feels when confronted with something above ordinary regulations. At the corners of the stage, spotlights flickered, clearing a path for the graduates of the last group. The old man felt his heart beat faster. In a moment, the son's name would be called. He traced the back of the envelope with his palm, as if hoping his wife's letter could grant him strength. His comrades remained silent, yet each sat tense, as though preparing for a formal assembly drill. This was their battle without any gunfire, without shouting, without bloodshed. It was a fight to keep the right to remember, to live among those they had sworn to protect. The host stepped onto the stage and announced, "Dear friends, we are concluding our ceremony. Now, a distinguished graduate who excelled in studies and community service will be invited up." The son's name rang out like a bell, dispelling a foggy haze. The hall erupted into applause. The old man rose without turning toward the police or paying attention to the lingering pain of his old wound from Baku. His eyes were fixed only on his son. The young man ascended the steps, accepted the diploma from the principal's hands, and suddenly the room fell silent. He did not hurry to leave. The son turned slowly toward the audience, scanning the rows as if seeking someone. He found his father's gaze and held it for a moment, conveying in silent communication all that no microphone could express. Then, while grasping his dark jacket, he made a deep bow to the uniformed people sitting among the crowd. The subtle gesture of the young man wounded hearts deeper than any speech. Without a doubt, the son understood the conflict, yet chose a language of gratitude instead of accusation. The old man felt tears welling and gripped the envelope tighter to keep them from falling. At that moment, he took a step forward and sat down again, because pride does not require fuss. After the last birthday celebrant, the director expressed gratitude to the guests and invited the students to proceed to the foyer for the customary photograph. The hall began to stand, yet nobody moved towards the exit. Everyone waited until the old man and his companions rose. This was a silent gesture of respect. The police chief was the first to step back, clearing the way. The sergeant opened the double doors wide. The veterans stood simultaneously, as if given a brief command to attention. Their steps were soft, but the chairs sighed beneath the renewed air. The old man rose last, slowly and deliberately, scanning the row of faces he might never see again. His gaze rested on the police officers. He bowed his head in acknowledgement of their service, while also marking the boundary between authority and the shared reality of peaceful days. The chief responded with a gesture neither grand nor small, a simple officer's bow. As the veterans neared the door, suddenly among the line, a girl of about 10 years appeared, slender as a birch twig. In her hands, she held a small bouquet of field daisies, a modest gift for the senior alumnus. She lifted the flowers above her head and shyly offered them to the old man. "These are for you," she said softly. Despite the quiet, the words echoed clearly. The old man paused, accepted the bouquet, and gently touched the girl's fingers. He found no lengthy speech and only said, "Thank you, dear granddaughter." The hall sighed. Some women discreetly wiped their eyes. The men cleared their throats, hiding their feelings. The girl. He returned to the family, while the old man, without releasing the daisies, stepped into the hallway. There, the cool air welcomed them with a blend of kitchen exhaust, the school cafeteria scent, and the smell of fresh paint on the walls. Soldiers of war and the everyday walls of a rural school, a contrast that for a moment even silenced the veterans' cane. In the corridor, the principal caught up with them and awkwardly thanked them for coming. He reached out his hand, but instead of shaking it, the old man handed over bouquets of daisies. "Give these to the girl so she knows her kindness has been remembered," he said. The principal nodded, his eyes shining as if he were a young man hearing words of gratitude from his first teacher once again. Meanwhile, in the assembly hall, parents and children were already heading for the exit. There, in the classroom foyer, near the stained glass window softly glowing with the setting sun's rays, the son waited for his father. He took off the pale blue graduation ribbon, laid it on the table against the wall, and lifted his gaze. The old man approached, almost stumbling. The wounds from long ago reminded him of their dull pain. The son grabbed his elbow to support him, but the father shook his head firmly. "I will stand here a little longer." They looked at each other, as people who can sense different levels of silence. The school photographer clicked the camera. Parents bustled around. Yet in their small circle there was a different time, suspended outside the general flow. The son was about to speak, but the father raised his hand. "Let me speak first." He sighed, as if lifting an invisible weight only they could feel. "Your mother dreamed of seeing this day, I promised her I would be here." He touched the pocket where the envelope was lying there, but he did not open it. "I stayed because words are stronger than steel. Remember that." The son nodded, tears welling up in his eyes, yet he held them back, unwilling to show his father any sign of weakness. "I want to be like you." The old man smiled, a weariness in his expression, like a traveler after a long day. "You are already better," he replied, "because you live without war. Hold on to that." They embraced silently, without loud words or raised hands, simply placing their palms on each other's shoulders. At that moment, a photographer tried to capture the scene, but the lens fogged up. The temperature difference between the hall and corridor played a trick, yet no one noticed the technical flaw. The human moment was simply too powerful. Classmates of the son arrived and greeted the old man. The youthful faces did not yet fully grasp the significance of what had happened, but felt that a real story was nearby. The old man responded to each with a brief handshake that held no pain, only gratitude that these children had witnessed a lesson in dignity. Veterans lined the corridor wall, waiting for their friend. They did not rush, as the experience of war had taught them patience. When the old man finally headed toward the exit, they closed ranks on either side, forming an honor guard. A girl with daisies hugged a director's folder and smiled in the corner, shining like a small sun. Graduates approached, a lively group in festive attire. They fell silent while passing the veterans' line and resumed their chatter only after turning the corner, as if respect required this pause. The old man noticed how one of the son's classmates, a tall and slender boy wearing glasses, paused and quietly said, "Thank you." Then, after a brief pause, he caught up with his friends. These words sank deep like seeds into warm soil and would grow when the time was right. Upon stepping outside, the evening air in the yard greeted them with the scent of linden trees and the murmur of the village road, along which parents' cars hurried by. The sky gradually darkened, but the western horizon remained golden, as if a lamp burned somewhere beyond sight. The old man took a step onto the concrete stair and felt a slight dizziness. The noise, intense emotions, and long-lasting fatigue overwhelmed him all at once. A comrade's cane rested under his arm, providing support, and the old man sighed with relief. "We will get to the car together," whispered his companion. In the schoolyard, a young police sergeant appeared from somewhere. Without a cap, he looked almost like a boy. He approached, stopped 2 steps away, lowered his head, and said, "Forgive me. I never meant to." The senior veteran lifted his cane and gently touched the sergeant's shoulder with his sleeve. "Serve honestly, son. That is enough." The sergeant nodded, as if he had just received both a scolding and advice, then walked away, wiping his eyes with his palm. The son opened the door of an old Volga car that his father had kept for many years as a memento of his first officer's purchase. Inside on the back seat lay a bouquet of flowers prepared for his mother. The old man sat down, supporting his chest, while his friend settled in nearby cars. Before closing the door, the veteran took one last look around. The school still had lights glowing in the auditorium windows. He imagined music, not the school anthem, but a distant, harsh whisper of the wind over the mountains. Yet this whisper brought peace instead of fear. The cars began to move. The son drove carefully and spoke quietly, as if afraid to disturb his father. "Tomorrow we will go to the cemetery to see Mother. I will tell her everything." The old man nodded. "She will hear you." Words came with difficulty. His head was pounding, and his heart, after a long day of work, begged for rest. Outside the window stretched fields and roadside poplars appeared faintly. A sweet scent of freshly cut hay burst in through the windows. The old man held an envelope on his lap. He planned to open it tomorrow at his wife's grave because there the letter would be clearer than among strangers. The road gently vibrated under the wheels, rocking them. The father closed his eyes, letting his thoughts settle. This was not sleep, but rest on the road. He dreamed of the sky above the mountain pass, yet this sky held neither mines nor sirens, only the soft flutter of cranes' wings that once flew back to their homeland. Meanwhile, 2 veterans' cars stopped by the roadside. Friends stepped out, straightening their backs as if their old uniforms still compelled them to stand tall. They did not say goodbye, but silently shook hands, nodded, and touched the ribbons on their chests. Since the war ended, they rarely met, but each knew that if one called, the others would come, just like today. The police vehicles remained at the school. The chief stood on the porch holding a report in his hand. He gazed into the distance, where a 2-vehicle convoy had disappeared. Old sedans filled the streets as he realized, the report will be brief. It is possible to document what happened, but impossible to fully explain. Too much heart is poured into every moment. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, then glanced up at the sky. The evening had erased the pink glow, giving way to a clear summer night. The elderly man leaned back against the headrest, listening as his son shared his plans, enrolling in university, a summer work camp, and home repairs. The son's voice brought calm, while outside the window twinkled the lights of villages, like brief signals from sailors greeting their returning ship. The old man brushed a faint smile across his lips. The ship had come back, even if after stormy seas. As the car turned onto the gravel road leading into their hometown, with the last lamps glowing in the windows, the old man opened his eyes wide. The house stood exactly where it had 20 years ago, only the roof had darkened, and the front yard had become overgrown with lilacs. He stepped out, inhaled the cool night air, and slowly straightened up. "Held on," he whispered, speaking both to himself and to those no longer here. His son placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Let's go inside." They walked along the path, the sand crunching softly beneath their feet. Behind them, the car door light glowed on. His wife had refused to leave the envelope of the letter behind. In the kitchen, the scent of dill and freshly baked bread filled the air. Though it was nearly midnight, the son boiled the kettle. When the cups were filled with steaming water, the old man reached into his inner pocket and pulled out his army tag, placing it carefully on the table. Next to it lay a medal. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he removed the ribbon from the current celebration pinned to his chest. The son watched silently, understanding the weight of the moment without interrupting. He knew his father was reflecting on a lifetime intertwined with memories too deep for words. He builds a bridge from conflict to harmony. The old man said, "Strength is not measured by a fist. Strength is measured by how many people someone can carry on their shoulders without bending." "I will remember," the son replied. The tea grew cold, the street fell silent, and it seemed as if the whole world had settled to listen to the quiet conversation between 2 generations. Outside, above the garden, the moon shone bright and perfectly round, like a silver button on a winter coat. The daisies in the vase near the window looked upwards, as though searching for something to fill the pause. The son and father did not rush or speak. They needed no more words. The house welcomed them with muted light from a wall lamp whose shade had long stopped closing properly. Outside the open window, the apple tree softly crackled. A branch brushed the frame, as if reminding them of the years when the home was filled with lively family noise. The son led his father to the living room, helped him remove his jacket, and carefully laid it over the back of the chair. Both of the old man's hands trembled after the long day, yet his fingers remained steady. He sat down, resting an envelope on his lap, and took a deep breath. The son took off his graduation tie, stuffed it in his trouser pocket, and squatted beside him to look into his face. The youth's face still held traces of childhood. In the soft glow of the lamp, his cheeks appeared almost translucent. "Dad," he began softly, "I saw how they bothered you. I wanted to say something right away." But the old man raised his hand like during their martial arts lessons, signaling silence. "I did not want a scene," he answered calmly. "It was more important that you got your diploma," and left the stage with his head held high. The son lowered his gaze. It seemed to me that if I intervened, they would feel shame. "Shame does not come from loud words," the father replied. "It comes from example." The young man sat down beside me on the carpet, leaning his back against the sofa. He took off his polished shoes and spun them in his hands as if he did not recognize them. "What if they really removed you?" he asked, barely breathing. The old man paused for a moment, then quietly, without a trace of pride, said, "I would step outside, and you would watch my back and understand that true strength lies in walking calmly, even amid whistles." The son sighed. "I will remember." The father touched an envelope. The paper held the scent of an old printing house and a faint bitterness of medicine from the hospital ward, where his wife was writing her final lines. "Do you want to hear her letter?" he asked. The son nodded. The old man carefully cut the edge open with a letter opener that always rested in the drawer of the table near his armchair. The thin sound of paper tearing filled the room like an echo of past years. He pulled out the sheet, unfolded it with trembling fingers, and began to read without looking up. "Kolya, you held my hand when we said goodbye, and I knew you would not let promises become empty words. Today, I ask one last thing. Be there when our son receives his first document in adult life. If it becomes hard, remember the day you returned from the hospital and smiled for the first time as if the pain was behind you. I believe that light in your eyes will ignite again. I know that someday it will be reflected in the face of our son, a boy. Offer him a model that can withstand any storm." The words chimed softly like a gentle bell. The son, overwhelmed, covered his face with his hands. "I did not know she was writing to you," he whispered. "She was not writing only to me," the father gently corrected him. "She was writing to both of us." The old man folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, and set it on the table. Then he rested his hand on his son's shoulder. "Did you see today how my friends entered the hall?" "I did. They did not come out of pride. They came because once we shared a field together, and as long as at least one is alive, others come to help." The son raised his head. "In life, there is the field. Yes, sometimes it is mountains, sometimes a graduation hall, sometimes an ordinary yard. There will always be a place where truth is tested." The son sat down beside his father on the couch. "Dad, what should I do so I do not disgrace your faith?" "Live honestly. Do not fear being tall in silence." The old man smiled with the corners of his mouth. "And never humiliate those whose eyes show pain." Silence settled in the room. The wall clock ticked steadily. From the kitchen came the faint groaning of the old refrigerator. The father closed his eyes, listening to these calm sounds of a home that had weathered many storms. The son broke the quiet. "I signed up for a volunteer program at a children's center. I want to help boys who lack fathers." The old man's shoulders trembled slightly. A wise decision. The greatest reward is to see another's dignity grow. The son moved closer and, as if he were small again, rested his head on his father's lap. Slowly, the old man ran his fingers through his son's hair, a silent gesture filled with tenderness. Every child remembers it. He recalled how a boy once fell asleep in the same way, resting after a long illness. Now time completed its circle, yet its meaning remained unchanged. The son seeks strength, the father offers it. When you were in Afghanistan, were you afraid? A quiet question was asked. The old man did not answer immediately. Fear is always there, but it is not the most important thing. The main point is to keep moving forward even when you are scared, because others depend on you. The son nodded. So, I can move forward when I am afraid. You already are moving, the father replied. They stayed seated until the clock hands passed the first hour of the night. Then the old man straightened up. Go to sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day. The son helped him rise. They walked down the corridor towards the bedroom door. At the threshold, the old man turned around. Remember, the strong do not humiliate. The strong lift others up. The son nodded, and that nod was enough. In the dark room, the old man lay down on the bed. On the bedside table, a lamp glowed with a small flame, and in its light, a letter from his wife rested, as if guarding his sleep. Through the open window, the evening breeze passed, swaying the curtain. The wind smelled of steppe and daisies, like that mature spring when he first returned to the village after the war. The old man closed his eyes, hearing a faint noise in his ears. But now in that noise, there were no explosions or commands. There was only the winged rustle of cranes flying far above. He whispered into the darkness. We made it, Nina, and fell asleep, allowing himself a quiet smile. Morning in the village began with the ringing of the well chain and the distant barking of guard dogs. Dawn peeked through the windows, filling the room with soft light. He painted golden stripes on the walls and awakened the garden, where Kalina gently swayed with her red clusters. The old man woke up early, a soldier's routine stretching across his whole life. He sat on the bed, listening to the whispers of his joints, but sensed instead a lighter springiness. His body, as if realizing its duty was fulfilled, granted him an extra surge of strength. His son was still asleep in the next room. The old man dressed, stepped outside, and inhaled the fresh scent of dew. The gravel underfoot was cool, and the sky was clear like a brand-new notebook. He settled on a wooden bench beneath the apple tree, where for many years he had greeted dawn alongside his wife. In his hands lay a bouquet of daisies, which the director had returned late yesterday evening. The white petals were slightly darkened by the night moisture, yet their fragrance had grown more delicate. Soon, friends came out of the house. They paused, honoring the early morning silence. Some picked up pieces of bread. Others lit cigarette smoke. The eldest leaned on his cane, spat a tiny invisible speck of war dust into the dew, and said, "It's time." Everyone nodded. The son brought the car to the gate, left open by Nastasha, as if the whole world invited them in. The old man sat up front. Close by were the daisies and an envelope. The route to the cemetery ran behind a hill between birch groves, where the air smelled of resin. When they reached the fence, the sun rose above the tree line. A cobweb over the marble gleamed like a fine cello string. The son helped his father out. Veterans followed quietly, serious, dressed in civilian jackets, yet walking with a military stride. At his wife's grave, the old man placed. He gently ran his palm over the smooth stone and placed an envelope on top. He did not open the letter. Its message had already been conveyed. He stood silently while the leaves rustled around like the distant rhythm of helicopter blades. Friends formed a semicircle, removing their hats. No prayers were spoken. Their silence held more meaning than words could express. The old man straightened up and faced his companions. Looking into each of their eyes, he quietly yet clearly said, "Thank you." That was enough. No orchestra, no trumpets, no shouts. Just the morning light and the gentle chill of the stone beneath my hand. They slowly walked to the car. The son paused at the stone for a moment, as if speaking to his mother what he had not managed to say yesterday. Then he caught up. When the old man got into the car, he glanced back once more. At the open gate of the cemetery, women stood with buckets, ready to tend the graves of their loved ones. They stepped aside, allowing the veterans to pass, and one of them said, "Wishing you a long life." The old man raised his hand and nodded. The car moved along the narrow road, still wet from the dew. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting golden stripes dancing across the windshield. The sun drove steadily, without hurry. In the rearview mirror, the cemetery fence gradually disappeared, taking with it the tension of the previous day. Somewhere in the middle of the field, the old man spotted a flock of cranes standing. They flew in a wedge shape toward the north. Their wings gleamed white in the morning light. He touched his son's shoulder and said, "Look." The son slowed down and rolled down the window. The sharp cry of the cranes pierced them both like a thin needle, mixing joy and sorrow in the same moment. At the same moment. "Mother's song," the young man whispered. The old man smiled. "That is right." The car moved forward once more. The son shifted the gear, and the engine's effort blended seamlessly with the rustle of the tires. Ahead lay an ordinary day filled with unpacking, calls to neighbors, and preparations for university. Yet at the very core of this day, a quiet yet powerful flame burned in the light of the early morning. The old man leaned his head back on the headrest. He closed his eyes, listening to the cry of cranes above, and suddenly realized, every person has their own triumphant march. For some, it plays beneath the drums in the main square. For others, it sounds in the school hall among chairs and old lamps. And for some, it echoes in the morning fields where cranes call. The main thing is to hear it, and not to ignore. He heard it. Outside the window, the sun rose higher, promising a hot summer day. The day before, golden streaks of humiliation had disturbed their hearts. But now, those streaks transformed into bands of light, soaking into the earth just as rain is absorbed into the ripening grain. Meanwhile, the car drove on, the crew silent. The silence filled the cabin with a reverence similar to mountain stillness, where once the most crucial battle was fought. The battle for the right to remain human. When the road brought them to the top of a hill, a vast expanse of fields unfolded before their eyes, where lazy waves of green rye swayed. The old man asked to stop. He stepped out, resting his palm on the car's fender, and gazed at the horizon for a long time. Here, among these tillable lands, his father had once met soldiers after the Great Patriotic War. The son stood quietly nearby, not disturbing him. The wind blew gently. The young man's curls stirred as he toyed with the metal resting on the elder's chest. "Remember," the old man said softly, "the earth understands best those who keep their promises." The son echoed quietly, "The earth and the heart." They shared a knowing smile before they stepped into the car, gently descending the hillside and fading into the morning haze, a scent of bread, grass, and an approaching peaceful day filling the air. Far away, a bell from a small wooden church lazily rang out 3 long, deliberate tones in a row. "Yeah,